Hello and welcome to my second episode of my second chapter of my dev blogs. Within this episode, I'll be making a histogram based audio reactor. This will be very reminiscent of my spectrogram that I made sort of in my first chapter. So yeah, let's get started. So to begin, I went about creating the foundation of the effect. So for this histogram effect, there'll be individual lines to make up the graph. So this is that step, creating the lines. And with that, I also went about giving it some movement as well. And this movement I'll be able to use as a variable for the information that comes out of the audio spectrum. So I'll be able to tie the movement to the audio here. So on this next step, I go about creating the audio spectrum for the effect. So here I'm putting my audio into the scene, run it through an audio spectrum, but then I do end up using a resampler as well, since as the audio comes out of the audio spectrum, the results that I get from it, the sample numbers are too high. So what this means is when I tie that to my actual histogram, I'm going to have too many points in my waveform. So I go about resampling. So then that way I have way less amount of samples per individual waveform, and as a result it makes the effect look much more crisp as the end result. Otherwise it looks way too busy, I guess you'd say. So in this next part, I go about building the piece that is basically responsible for splitting the frequencies. So far the audio goes through the audio spectrum, it gets resampled, and then it comes out, but it's still one consistent line. So this will break it down into 20 individual sort of nodes, I guess you'd say, and each of these would have 3 samples. So then I could then use this information for each of the individual lines. This would be responsible for the movement of those individual lines within the histogram. And at this next point, I go about setting up the trail for the effect. So basically this part will be responsible for, as each of the lines continue to move and more information goes through the histogram, this part will be responsible for leaving a trail behind in each of the individual lines as the music continues to play. Now, at this stage, I begin to sort of bring everything together and begin to build the sort of render nodes to complete the look. So yeah, I begin applying all the materials that are needed for the effect. So up until this point, we've sort of made the skeleton of the effect. So this part would sort of be responsible for the material, the way it looks, how it stands in the scene. So I used a multitude of differing nodes, mainly the geometry node and the camera viewport, and then those will be piped into the render node, and that will give us the start of our post-processing nodes as well. Yeah. So after bringing in the viewfinder and viewport, I'll slow down the video here. You can see that the histogram in between each of the individual lines, it actually loops back again. So I have all these unintended sort of artifacts in the way of the effect. So in the next stage, I'll go about removing those so that we just have a set of individual histogram lines. In the first step, I went about creating those individual lines along that graph. This stage here will basically tell that graph anything in between those individual lines won't have to be registered. So when this comes out on the output, those artifacts that I was speaking about earlier, they'll be removed from the scene. So with the last steps completed and the removal of those unwanted pieces within the effect, I start to go about adding the post-productive aspects of this audio visualizer. So here I'm just sort of tweaking the intensity of the histogram, just so that any wavelengths don't go off the screen. As well as this, I changed the color of the material, and as you can see, I start playing around with the color of the histogram itself. And then once I've decided on the color and the lighting as well, I wield the bloom tool again, and yeah, I'll state this again, the bloom tool is incredibly good for audio visualizers, since it adds a layer of color that can be different in different areas. So as certain areas of the audio visualizer visualize, they'll have differing colors in differing sections. So yeah, it makes for a really good post-productive node. So once I was happy with the post-productive settings that I applied, it was time to get on with my first render for this audio visualizer.
When I am weak, you're telling me that I'm strong. When I'm right, you're telling me that I'm wrong. But I know, now I understand. Now I see your wicked plan. I'm a junglist, 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 junglist. I'm a junglist.
For this first render for this histogram audio visualizer, I'm generally quite happy with how it turned out. Visually, it's a very visually stunning visualizer. I think the color works great, and also it does a great job at actually visualizing. However, the issue that I do have is that in certain areas when the audio becomes quite full, the histogram becomes very congested in areas, as you can see on the left. So I did end up coming back to this effect, and I did end up revisiting it and making some tweaks.
I see your wicked plan, I'm a junglist.
So with this second render, I'm generally much happier with how the effect turned out. I went back, I altered the color, and I also altered the bloom effect to work in such a way where it's almost sort of height based, and as the waveforms become, as they come together really, they have a sort of mist that's attached to them, and it works as a great highlight for the overall visualizer. And I also went about changing the song again for this second render, mainly because this song, again, it works way better in audio visualizers. Each of the waveforms has great differentiation, so when it goes through the visualizer, it's much greater depicted than the other song. As well as this, I went about tweaking some of the numbers on the nodes that are responsible for reading the audio. And this basically made the whole effect more consistent. There would be less individual lines that sort of went rogue and would sort of be out of place. This is the end of my second episode of my second chapter of devblogs. I'm extremely happy with how this effect turned out and the general TouchDesigner workspace in general, and I'll see you again in the next episode.